People who were part of a cult. When did Guy realize, oh, I'm in a cult? When I went to some Scientology event, was told I would really enjoy, and there's a standing ovation for the founder literally every 5 minutes. My mom used to be a Scientologist. Very briefly, over 40 years ago, I get calls somewhat regularly from very young sounding, professional people from that band of lunatics, always trying to talk to her or figure out how to contact her. How they got my number I'm not sure, but it's spooky and I yell at them every time. When I was 17 to 18, my friends and I, guys and girls, were big hippie stoners, and we would go to this active meditation dance event with the hippie crowd in our city. Then this one time we attended a private event called an intensive where all these new agers kind of broke us down and got us to talk a lot about our sexuality, and everybody was crying and shit. I was like, that was weird. And then a few kids in my crew went to another one, and reported that it was different in that there were more adults. Everybody wore all white, and that at one point they rolled out a TV with a video of Sri Bhagavan Osho Rajneesh talking, long dead, and everyone started yelling, "We love you Osho, we love you." At that point I was like, yeah, probably weird that I'd been spending so much time with middle-aged ladies in tie-dye tights trying to bang me. Taught me how to like dancing, though. When they call their leader, the chosen one, it's time to realize it's a cult. When they said, don't hang out with non-JW people, they are evil. I was in that organization for a long time. I was clueless about everything. It's an evil organization and I hope it fall down one day. I have such a special hatred for that cult. I lost an aunt to it and a friend to it. In both cases, they used the same tactic. Both my aunt and friend were emotionally fragile, and one of the JWs latched onto them, separated them from family and friends, and eventually fully pulled them out of our lives. When our friend would still visit us, they shipped him and his new wife overseas. My aunt eventually got out, and the stories she tells about how insane these people are unnerving. Oh, and by the way, apparently the JWs have an online team that searches for comments like these, so expect some apologist replies. I was a part of Soga Gokkai International. They never really followed Buddhist philosophy, and were quite materialistic. I realized it was a cult when we were to all watch a video from our president and we were not allowed to record it or film anything. That's when I realized I was in a cult. Looked them up. Came here expecting this one. 2 of my aunts have been in it since the 80s. I went to college in the same city as one of them and she got me into it for a while. I got into Buddhism on my own before that, so it seemed a natural progression. Nope. Realized it was a cult when all the other members had framed photos of their leader on the walls in their house. Also got suspicious of how pro-democracy they supposedly were, but their leader was never elected and had been in place since the 1960s. My aunt got super weird and emotional when I tried to casually mention I just wasn't that into chanting anymore. She didn't speak to me for 6 months after I quit. I accepted an invitation to a seminar at the local convention center to learn about how to add some financial stability to my life. It was an Amway recruitment meeting, and I was very ashamed because this was the second time in my life that I got tricked into attending an Amway recruitment meeting. There were obvious ringers in the crowd. Even though everyone sitting was supposedly newcomers, I could identify the ringers by their irrationally enthusiastic clapping, and by the frequent use of Amway Glister Mint trademark refresher spray. When I was told that it's not a very nice thing to pray for the end of the world and the death of billion unbelieving people. Started out innocently enough. I was a young teen Christian working at Hobby Lobby, and one day these 2 nice men only a few years older than me asked if I wanted to come to a Bible study. They gave me an address and a phone number to appease my parents, who dropped me off for the first one. The Bible study started with about half a dozen of us, including the 2 who invited me, and everything seemed all above board. Then they started speaking in tongues. I was mildly weirded out, but I'll get back to that in a minute. After I got home, my parents asked me how it went. I told them about the night and that they identified themselves at the end as a group called The Way. Almost immediately, my stepdad pulls out a book about identifying Christian cults and hands it to me. Turn to The Way's chapter. But what makes them a cult? The book had a checklist of criteria of what defines a Christian cult. Most of them involved deviating from the New Testament in crucial points. The Way, for example, does not hold to Immaculate Conception virgin birth. among other things. That's a pretty big deal. The speaking of tongues was another, not the practice itself, but the way it is performed. According to the apostles, speaking in tongues is only acknowledged by the church if it's 1 spontaneous, and 2 interpreted by a different member of the congregation. The speaking of tongues during my indoctrination Bible study was very much not that. The leaders took turns saying something in tongues and then immediately translating themselves. I was sitting there thinking, what the actual Christ is happening? The end of the story is that they gave me a call asking if I wanted to come for another study. I told them that my parents told me to stay away. If they tried after that, I never found out as I never answered the phone. So your dad just kept a book on identifying Christian cults lying around? I didn't realize I was in a cult until years after I left. I was heavily involved for about a year from ages 15 to 16. Practices of the cult: the aforementioned clothed orgy, where we would stand or crouch together, sometimes in a human furniture type position. A new Bible, that didn't include too much blasphemous content, to prove our collective devotion to God. Glossolalia, hypnotism, and the occasional bit of physical violence, i.e., exhortation from the adults involved that we were not to tell our parents about what was happening. Why I stayed in the cult: peer pressure, a huge crush on one of the auxiliary youth pastors. It honestly didn't feel too different from the various fundy churches I'd been carted around to as a kid. I went to a church for about a year that was pretty cult. Why? Every week the pastor would say that he felt someone in the crowd was in need of healing, and every week someone would conveniently have a relatively minor injury, like a hurt back or sprained wrist. This started to raise red flags right away, because it wasn't a very big church, but somehow they never seemed to run out of clumsy fools who had just stubbed their toe that morning. Then the pastor would demand everyone come over and touch the person who was hurt, and they'd pray, and the hurt person would start laughing and jumping up and down because it would miraculously start to feel better immediately. I grew up in one until my dad passed away when I was 15. My brother got educated and started questioning things, and he got excommunicated. I thought about it and said, why would God want you expelled from worshipping him? I left and started analyzing stuff. It's insane, some stuff I used to believe. I'm angry at myself. My mom is still in the cult. I escaped just in time before joining. I was invited to a seminar. People were chanting slogans, praising the founder and the seminar leader, celebrating the members' accomplishments and how many new members they recruited. And that's when I realized the person who invited me lied and wanted me to officially join, not just go to an event party for fun. That was the last time I ever said yes to anything from Tupperware. In college I went to a few Bible studies with people I'd met. Nice folk, but not my thing. I heard stories later about intense questioning if you missed any meetups. And when one married couple who had been apart for a few months, I think due to work travel, were going to skip a meetup to get reacquainted and spend the evening together, the group tried to discuss with them just how often it was appropriate for a married couple to have sex. I think they lost some members after that bout of crazy. I was at the Rocky Horror Picture Show, and they told everyone to stand up like usual at the beginning of a show, and they said anyone who has seen the show 100 times, sit down, and I did. And that's when I knew I was in a cult. Be your own boss. Oh great, I'm at some MLM group pitch. Pretty much the same as a cult. I recently enrolled at a private school which ended up being more of an elitist cult than a school. We were given an orientation lecture and had to listen to the dean speak. I knew it was a cult or cult like when the dean said to us, when someone asks you who you are, say to them, I come from school name. I am school name. School name is me. And then he said, say it with me. And then we had to repeat his words, saying that our school was our identity. When utilizing career services, we also were required to include the school's logo on the top of our resume, as if they owned us or something. Almost reminds me of the Wave book, where a teacher and some students were doing a social experiment to learn why so many people followed Hitler willingly. Students took it too far and turned most of the school into an oppressive cult. Did I mention this was based off of a true story? About 3 to 4 years after I left, I was kicked out for getting assaulted by one of the leaders and told my mom I didn't want to go back. I lived near suicide for those years after, questioning everything I ever knew. It took a new friend explaining to me what a cult was for me to realize that's what I'd grown up in. After that it was all uphill. AA can be pretty culty depending on the meetings you go to. I went to one meeting regularly where they didn't want me to interact with anyone outside the program. They also wanted men to devote all my free time to AA by doing service commitments and going to multiple meetings a day. They also told me to use the program as my higher power if I couldn't find my own conception of a higher power. I thought it was weird to think of the program as basically being God. Everyone also wanted to know my life story down to the nitty-gritty details, and I would get criticized if I didn't want to share something. I ended up feeling worse about myself as a person because I constantly had to relive all the bad shit I had done. I ended up leaving AA and going to different recovery group that was a lot more relaxed. I have nothing against AA as a whole, it has helped millions of people. Also, like I said, it depends on the meeting, but the one I was going to seemed a lot like a cult and it made me not want any part of the program. I was briefly in a prosperity gospel cult. I was at a really low place in my life, gnarly alcoholism, and everyone was so kind. Everyone was my brother, sister, aunt. They always bought me lunch after church. The bishop who was in charge was not actually a bishop. He just called himself that. He started his own church after the old one asked him to leave when he got his side chick pregnant. There was all the theatrics of a black church, people fainting from the Holy Ghost, him anointing, healing people, etc. All of the services were recorded and streamed on his subscription website. He briefly had a show on Oxygen. There came a point where I was going to Bible study Tuesday and Wednesday night and 2 4-hour each services on Sunday. The church was in an unfinished warehouse in South Central LA. Bathrooms were porta potties outside. Everyone I saw was putting at least $20 minus $50 in the envelope every time, and most were tithing. I started putting $1 in envelopes beforehand so they didn't guilt me. A lot of them didn't even have money to take the bus. He very kindly gave out tokens. He has 5 bodyguards, a Jaguar, and a Maserati. I thought there was something really fishy about that. A woman told me I had to get rid of a Buddha keychain or God wouldn't love me. The absolute last straw for me was when the bishop got a private jet for his birthday. I asked who it was from and they were adamant that Jesus Christ bought it for him. No one could grasp the concept that it is all a huge scam. Cult is such a strong word. We just like to sell jams and jellies. When he looked me in the eyes and said, "You give me fortune, you give me fame, you give me power in your own God's name, I'm every person you need to be," I kind of realized it operated like a business. You can't advance if you don't shell out cash. We constant meet so the clergy can beg for money. We have gaudy ads plastered everywhere. Most churches don't operate like this. I slowly dissociated myself from the cult after that. I realized when there was no compassion shown by many of the people, so I left after being a part of the group for 7 years. No one reached out to ask if I was coming back or if I was going through something. It took a few months, but I realized they were more interested in money donated and controlling people's time. I knew several people who had lost everything to be a part of this cult. I am glad I got out when I did and have been way happier ever since. Grew up Mormon, did the whole shindig, Mormon missionary, married in the Holy Temple, only dated members, went to BYU, had kids immediately to fulfill my holy gender, and didn't finish my career at the behest of church leaders telling me that motherhood is the holiest calling on earth. Then around 28 years old, found a video about polyandry, men marrying already married women, and I was taken aback. Got me to actually research my religion for the first time. Was a bomb to my faith, and I spent hours upon hours reading the history of the Spaceballs of Christianity. Basically, you find out the church was founded off pedophilia and adultery. Left the church. Took my kids out. Marriage suffered a lot, and luckily my husband ended up doing his own research and he left as well. We lost all our friends. community, and it destroyed our business that was dependent on other members. Since we live in Utah, where we live, it's 80% Mormon, and we endured a lot of slander and bullshit, even from our own families. It's been hell, but it's heaven on the other side. But let me tell you that it was a learning curve to see how to navigate life outside the cult. I had to learn to order coffee. I had to spend a few hours shopping for clothes since I didn't know my own style out of holy underwear. My political views changed 180, and we are now fully tattooed, raising our kids to be unique individuals, and made friends with those that love us for us. Marriage was suffering and dying when in the church, and we managed to recover and start anew. I'd like to renew our vows since we were robbed of a real ceremony. You follow a strict list of rules your entire life, and then you leave. You discover yourself outside the cult propaganda of who they tell you to be. Living life now is a deep breath of fresh air.